Our keynote presentation is by Dr. Wendy Cukier, and she is the professor of entrepreneurship and innovation at the Ted Rogers School of Management at Toronto Metropolitan University. She's the founder and academic director of the Diversity Institute, the academic director of the Women's Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, and academic research director of the Future Skills Canada. This woman never sleeps. Please bring Wendy Cukier up to present the keynote presentation.
Thanks.
I'm a hugger.
Oh,
thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Marvelous. Yeah, I get a lot done because I'm really old. And I've been doing this for quite some time. And I'm at the stage where I have glasses that will allow me to read my notes or else to see you. The dog ate the glasses that allow me to see you, so apologies, I'm putting on the glasses that allow me to read my notes. So I'm really grateful to have been included here today because community benefits are something that the Diversity Institute's talked about a little bit in recent years, but only in the last couple have we really started diving into the industry and looking at the impact. In fact, we have a project coming up where we're going to try to develop more research to show the broader impacts of community benefits. Because I think in the panel before, you heard a lot about how community benefits benefit communities, but we're quite convinced that community benefits agreements also benefit the companies that are participating in them and Canada as a whole when we think about overall economic development, inclusion, and especially in the face of the trade wars, et cetera. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. I also wanted to say that that in the room today, how many of you identify as people who are from community organizations? And how many of you identify as people who work in the construction or infrastructure industry? So it's sort of a combination of both, which is great. What I wanted to talk about then was a little bit of context setting. And so I'm the research lead for something called the Future Skills Centre, which is a big investment by the Canadian government to try to equip Canadians for the workplace of the future. And obviously, when we look at infrastructure broadly, construction, whether it's residential or commercial, more narrowly, those are really important sectors in a whole variety of, for a whole variety of reasons. So we've been doing some research, and one of the reports that I'm going to pick the highlights from is there's a card on your table if you want to follow up. I'll also say that, you know, I'm a professor. I'm used to talking for 3 hours and then giving someone a test. So I have a lot of stuff on my slides, which I'm going to go through really quickly. If you want them, you can have them. If you don't, you're smart. I did want to talk a little bit about how we see community benefit agreements fitting into the overall strategy around future skills as well as equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I also wanted to confront head-on some of the issues around backlash because we are seeing things that I never imagined I would ever see in my lifetime occurring. You know, to have a presidential candidate claim that immigrants eat cats and dogs on national television is probably what I thought was going to be the low point of low points, and of course it's just got worse. And the thing is that in Canada, we're very much affected by American media, whether we like it or not. And I think that it's really important to make sure that we understand, A, what's really going on with the backlash, where it's coming from, but also why Canada's different and why we have to stand our ground. So, only one thing I wanted to say about the Diversity Institute, other than I'm old and it's been around for a long time. It's based in the business school. So while we have a very strong commitment to social justice and both equality and equity, or substantive equality, we really focus on how equity, diversity, inclusion, truth and reconciliation help organizations be more successful. And that's whether it's a university, a hospital, a large construction industry, a large construction company, Starbucks, Rogers, or a small medium enterprise. The evidence in our view is very, very clear that there's a very strong link between organizational practices around equity, diversity, inclusion, truth and reconciliation, and organizational performance. And we've got, the numbers that show that. The other thing that is important about the Diversity Institute is that we're pretty big. We have about 80 full-time staff, so we're involved in a lot of different projects with a lot of different organizations and groups, so we have a lot of data. And I wanted to share some of the highlights of that. So one of the things that is critically important is, and this is, I'll try to highlight the things that I think are most important because I'll talk a lot over the next few minutes. All workforce growth in Canada will come through immigration because the boomers like me are retiring or dying, and I want to do the first before I do the second, but sometimes it's not clear that's what's going to happen. But we have known this since the turn of the century, just doing the population projections. And what that means is, regardless of who says what when, Canada is actually in a global competition for talent. And so I'll talk more about that, but I think that's probably the very most important thing to remember is that we need immigrants. The second thing that is important to remember is that the population of Canada is becoming more diverse, and different women now are the majority of university graduates, but what's more important is we control 60 to 70% of purchase decisions, right? Like, we got power. We know that in a city like Toronto, half the population was born outside of Canada, half the population's racialized, half the population's women. So if you're not taking into account those groups, you're fishing in a pretty small pond. Whether you're looking for talent, whether you're looking to develop products and services, and in the current environment, when we know we need new trade relationships to ensure that we can be successful, the immigrant diaspora is our competitive advantage, right? You want to build relationships in Africa, in South Asia. You want to take advantage of the Asia-Pacific Free Trade Agreement or the CTAP, the European Trade Agreement. You're much better off if you've got people with local knowledge. So it's critically important from my perspective to make sure that we take what we would call an asset approach to thinking about diversity and inclusion. And while I recognize that community benefits agreements are often aimed at addressing the needs of what are referred to as underrepresented or marginalized communities, the fact is it's in everybody's interest to do so, and I'll talk more about that. We've heard a lot about the housing shortage, and I gave a speech recently at an event, and Neil Aurora, who used to be the chief statistician at Stats Canada, was sitting in the front row nodding when I said this. The data that was presented and shared in the echo chamber about the explosion, the exponential, the broken immigration system was misrepresented, and we can show that. What happened is during COVID, immigration dropped to almost zero. So after COVID, it increased. And if you look at the trend over time, it actually wasn't this massive, massive increase that some of the graphs that were published in things like the Globe and Mail suggested. So I think that's one thing that's really important, is a lot of the issues around immigration were misrepresented. But what's even more important is the analysis of immigrants being the source of all our problems. And I refer to the World Economic Forum's study on the global housing crisis. So housing crisis is a problem in countries that have lots of immigration as well as in countries that don't. But when they outlined what the solutions to the global housing crisis were, the first thing was changes to regulatory environments, making it easier, cutting red tape, all that stuff. The second thing was relax controls on immigration. Why? Because immigrants build houses. Immigrants build the infrastructure. Immigrants built Canada. They built the railroad. They built, to a large extent, the construction industry. They've built the businesses. They're far more likely to be entrepreneurs and so on. And so there was an incredible disconnect, in my view, between the reality and the rhetoric. And there's actually evidence that there was foreign interference that was trying to fuel the anti-immigrant sentiment. So regardless of whether you believe there's too much immigration, not enough immigration, it's really important to understand that a lot of the stuff that was represented was simply inaccurate. And once they said they're going to cut the levels, what happened? Businesses were going, what? Where are we going to get the workers? So I think it's really critical that we understand that the discussion around equity, diversity, and inclusion, the discussion around, my phone keeps shutting off so I can't see my notes. The discussion around immigration has to be framed based on evidence, and the evidence is really clear. There are labor shortages, and we need everybody to contribute. Markets are changing, we need to understand them. There are opportunities globally, we need to leverage people's expertise. And if that's not enough, it's really important to remember that Canada has fundamentally different rights, freedoms, legislative frameworks, jurisprudence, and legal obligations than what we see in the United States. So an executive order ain't going to change things for us. Our institutions are still firmly grounded in principles of human rights, Charter of Rights and Freedoms, employment equity, accessibility for persons with disabilities, and so on and so forth. And so I think those things are really important to remember, despite the noise that we see coming over the border. The other thing that has come through loud and clear are the issues around labor shortages in the sector. And I'm not going to go through this in great detail other than to say, there are ups, there are downs, but right now there are real shortages. And, anyone who's tried to, how many people in the room have all the employees they need in their organization? And the kind of the skills they need in their organization. And they're ready for the transformation of artificial intelligence. And they're ready for the tariffs, right? So I rest my case. Like, talent is what drives us, whether we're in government, the nonprofit sector, or the private sector. So we have to remember that those labor shortages are real and they're across sectors. We also have to remember that our infrastructure is aging. And I was on a panel with the Mayor of Ottawa, and he had a good definition of infrastructure. He said, infrastructure is all the stuff you don't think about until it stops working. And I think that's sort of true, right? Because whether we're thinking, whether we're thinking about the electrical grid, whether we're thinking about, sewage, whether we're thinking about roads, whether we're thinking about public institutions and so on, it's very clear that there's lots of work to be done, quite apart from the issues that we face with respect to housing. We also know, and this just reinforces the labor shortage things, we also know that innovation is occurring at an incredibly rapid pace. That also has implications for the labor force, for skills, for upskilling, for reskilling, for rethinking what it is that is required in a certain occupation. Some of that is being driven by the transition to green, and make no mistake about it, and get rid of the carbon tax, but there are about 32 other programs that are driving us in the direction of net zero, and they're not going away. There's also new processes. I mean, I've heard different views on this from people who are experts, but certainly in housing, I think some of the modular construction processes are kind of interesting. When you look at shortages in the far north and so on, there's lots of stuff there that's interesting. And at the very least, we're seeing new interesting applications of robotics and digital twins and all kinds of technologies. So there, in addition to the shortages, just the pure shortages of labor, we're also seeing shortages in terms of skill sets that are going to be required to drive innovation and productivity. And then we know that despite all of the shortages and despite the companies that are screaming that they don't have enough talent, there are certain segments of the population that are still underemployed generally, and underrepresented in particular in construction. And so women are a very small percentage of the workforce, and it's kind of amazing that the Crosstown project is really pushing the envelope on that. We know as well that Indigenous peoples tend to be underrepresented, although there are increasingly programs, especially in the far north, to try to leverage local talent and so on. And we know that overall, and we got lots of data on this, the business case for equity, diversity, inclusion, truth and reconciliation, accessibility has not changed, despite the noise. As the population's changing, the talent pool's changing. As the population's changing, markets are changing. We know that all great minds don't think alike, and that diversity and inclusion drive innovation. And we know there are also issues around risk management. And so those people who think, because the President of the United States says we can't have affirmative action anymore, that has any impact on employment equity or pay equity or any of the other legislation in Canada, they need to give their heads a shake. And we just finished a research project with Environics that tells us very clearly that most Canadians in the workplace think we have the right amount of focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion, or we need more. Only about a quarter of working Canadians think there's too much emphasis on equity, diversity, and inclusion. That may surprise people, because if you think about the noise you hear, you might have the impression that attitudes have changed dramatically. And I can tell you, based on a survey of 5,000 Canadians from across the country, it hasn't. The other thing we know is that even in the United States, executives still recognize the business case and the importance of equity, diversity, and inclusion being driven not by political correctness or something, or even by corporate social responsibility, but by business realities. We know that procurement as a lever to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion, and particularly community benefits agreements, are much better developed in the United States than in Canada. They're not new to Canada, but we see they are newer than they were in the US, and you heard that a little bit on the panel, like community benefits, set-asides, programs that really focused on ensuring that money for big projects flowed to communities, very, very well established for decades across the United States. And we're just starting to embed those principles at different levels in our governments and our public institutions. And I'm not going to go through the sort of basic introduction to why community benefit agreements are important, because I think all of you know that. I just wanted to say that one of the projects that we're working on is really trying to quantify that in more specific terms. So you saw some of the data on how many people have been hired, how it's changed the workforce, how much money has gone into local businesses, including Little Jamaica, and we've done quite a lot of work in building entrepreneurial skills in that community. But what we want to look at are the broader impacts, and the broader impacts are the multiplier effects. The broader impacts are what happens if you take someone and employ them and they can therefore feed their family and their kids don't have to work 20 hours a week while they're going to school, and so on and so forth. And part of the reason we want to look at those multiplier impacts is because in some sectors it's a given. Some of you will know probably Jim Stanford. He was the economist for the Canadian Auto Workers, then Unifor. And he was someone who really popularized the notion of the multiplier effect. Have anyone in the audience heard about the multiplier effect? A couple. So I grew up in a GM town, and the multiplier effect was basically the principle that was used to continue to argue that we had to support the auto sector, because the argument was you lose one auto sector job, you lose 6 more that are dependent on it. It was sort of the ripple effects. But those principles, in my view, can also be applied to thinking about community benefit agreements, because you're creating employment for people who might otherwise be what? On social assistance, earning less money, have less of a career before them. What's the impact of that on them, on their family, and on the community more broadly? And I think that we need to get beyond the simple numbers of this many jobs, this much money going in, and really start to think about what the ripple effects are of some of those investments. So we're trying to think about how you can change. There it is. We are trying to think about different ways to frame community benefit agreements and their strategic value, not just to communities, but to employers. Their financial implications, not just to communities, but to employers. The economic impact, the political impact, and so on. And I'm not going to go through this because you had excellent presentations on that. I want to say a couple of words about backlash, and then I'll wrap up. So all of you have seen this stuff, right? People backing off their commitments around equity, diversity, and inclusion in the US in particular. And it's important to understand that the executive orders that have come out have targeted specifically what we would term affirmative action programs. Programs where one set of people are preferred over others because of historic disadvantage. And so they've gone after the universities that had set aside scholarships for Black students and so on. But some of the fundamental principles that underpin equity, diversity, and inclusion are not under attack. And there are some high-profile companies that have backed off. But there are also a lot of companies that have not. And it's, in my view, really important to remember that backlash is not new. I don't know that anyone in the room, maybe a couple of people, are old enough to remember the civil rights movement in the United States and the incredible progress that was made with desegregation and so on. That did not come without cost. That did not come without backlash. When we think about the women's movement in the United States, there was actually a book in 1991, Susan Flutie's book, called Backlash, The War on Feminism, because as women were making gains, some people thought they were losing out. And in an environment where people are feeling the pain of economic uncertainty and disruption, often they will target, quote, the other and blame others for their problems. And I think that one of the things that we have to do, those of you who work in equity, diversity, and inclusion, is try to get inside of the heads of the people who are not supportive. The people who are really opposed, not much you can do with them. The people who support you, great, but we're singing to the choir. The people we need to focus on are the people who are sort of sitting on the fence. And that's where I think a lot of the business case can be very helpful. And I just put up a quote from a PhD student's thesis where she cited an Indigenous elder who said, you know, when he was hunting bear, he learned that he needed to think like a bear. And I think too often we spend time talking to ourselves in the mirror rather than trying to really understand what's driving other people. And we had some good examples of how to get more people around the table and what will move them forward. Oops, sorry. That's 1, 2. I'm probably pointing in the wrong direction. I don't know. No, I want to go forward, sorry. Sorry, one back, one more. One more back? One more forward. There we go. It's important to remember that for every company that has backed off on its EDI commitments, there are multiples that have stuck with them and made it very clear that it's not about political correctness or wokeness, it's about business. And so when we think about what has to happen, we're really focused on the idea that we have to address high-level policy issues. And when you think about inclusion in the construction industry, that means tackling stereotypes, looking at interprovincial trade barriers. That means looking at regulatory frameworks and so on. At the organizational level, it means looking at policies and programs. And at the individual level, it means addressing skills and building capacity. And not just among people who are in equity-deserving groups, but also the gatekeepers. We have to educate our colleagues on why this is important and how it will benefit everybody. And I wanted to share, I don't know. I have a PhD in information systems, but I can't make anything work. Backwards one. There we go. Just share this. If you do a Google image search on carpenter, you will get carpenter ants, pictures of Jesus, and Karen Carpenter. Some of you may be old enough to remember, before you will get a picture of a woman carpenter. Right? Because the stereotypes about who a carpenter is and what a carpenter looks like are so deeply embedded. So we have to really push to challenge a lot of those assumptions. We have to think about our organizational practices, everything from HR to culture, but also how we design products and services. And anyone who is in the design side of the construction industry knows how much systems have changed and principles of design have changed in order to accommodate equity, diversity, and inclusion. We just did a a Canadian Standards Association standard for embedding equity, diversity, and inclusion into resilience and recovery planning systems for infrastructure. Because you have to think, you know, when you think about flooding, there are certain people who are more likely to be living in basement apartments than others, and how do you build in to your planning those sorts of issues? With the aging population, I'm one of them. You have to think about not just accessibility in traditional ways, but, you know, how long does the walk sign stay up for someone who's you know, slow and feeble? So there's a lot that can be done at the organizational level. But when we think about it, we have to continually push back at some of the assumptions that we hear every day. The infrastructure that is fundamental to Canada, and it's bridges, it's subways, but it's also our institutions. We have to think about it in a proactive way, and I was really pleased to see the federal government and the provincial governments are really trying to grapple with this at this time in a serious way. Implementation is another thing, of course. We have to remember that immigrants built this country, and so all of the stuff about immigrants being the problem ignores the fact that they're really part of the solution. And remember, there's a lot of overlap between immigrants and racialized people. We have to think about getting groups working together, and that's why I think community benefits are so incredibly powerful, because they bring together the community, job seekers, businesses, and the industry, as well as the unions, to really grapple with problems that are owned by all of us, not just some of us. And it's, from my point of view, really important to remember as we go into tougher times, as we're trying to build more self-reliance and resilience, that community benefit agreements could be an enormous part of the solution moving forward. So thank you very much for your attention, and thanks for being here today.